Now, the next thing to cover is body composition. This is where things get a little bit complicated. A lot of the situations I'm going to cover are not very likely at all, but it's important to highlight what is theoretically possible, what circumstances it's likely to happen, if at all, and to prove that these situations do not discredit calories in, calories out. People haven't broken calories in, calories out just because these situations have occurred. So, the first thing to cover is that different body tissues have different energy values. So, a pound of fat contains 3,500 calories. A pound of muscle contains 800 calories, and a pound of water, your body's water weight fluctuates, contains no calories. So, there are 9 different ways that your body composition could be altering at any given time. The first one is you could be gaining fat or adipose tissue. The second one is you could be gaining muscle or anabolic tissue. The third one is you could be gaining a mixture of fat tissue and muscle tissue. The fourth one is you could be losing fat tissue. The fifth one is you could be losing muscle tissue. The sixth one is you could be losing a mixture of fat and muscle tissue. The seventh one is that you could be gaining fat but losing muscle. The eighth one is that you could be gaining muscle but losing fat. And the last one is you're just maintaining your current body composition. There are no changes. 5 of these are able to happen within a surplus. 5 of them are able to happen within a deficit, and 3 of them are able to happen at maintenance. That does mean that there's some crossover, which can be confusing, but please bear with me. The crossover ones, some of the scenarios are technically possible in a surplus, a deficit, and at maintenance, but I will outline what's most likely to occur. So, first thing is within a surplus. The first scenario that's most likely to occur within a surplus for the majority of people, and particularly if you're not training, doing any resistance training, you will gain fat or adipose tissue. Simply, the excess calories that you're eating gets stored as fat tissue. The second scenario that can occur, which is most likely for people who are resistance training and also eating in a surplus, is that you will gain a mixture of muscle and fat. The amount of muscle you can gain and the amount of time you can gain muscle for is genetically predetermined. It's important to note here that those limits can be altered with the use of performance-enhancing drugs. I do not condone that, but for the sake of educational purposes and transparency within this video, that does need to be noted. So, this rate that you can build muscle at that's genetically predetermined, that means that only so many calories can go into muscle building over a period of time. So, for somebody who would gain 23 pounds of muscle in a year, this is a substantial amount. 23 pounds of muscle in a year requires 50 calories going into muscle building each day. That's because after 16 days, 800 calories would have gone into muscle building. That's worth a pound of muscle. You'd have gained a pound of muscle in 16 days. If you maintained that for 365 days over the year, you would have gained around just under 23 pounds of muscle. Now, the average person who's eating a surplus is obviously not only eating in a 50 calorie surplus to try and gain muscle. So somebody who is resistance training and eating in a surplus, they might be eating in a 200 calorie surplus. 50 calories goes towards muscle building. The other 150 calories would go into fat storage. Just like in the first scenario, excess calories go into the storage of adipose tissue. The third scenario that can occur, this is much less likely, is that all your calories do go into muscle building. As we just outlined, muscle building can only occur at a certain rate. This is only really going to happen if the person's in a very small surplus, so that all the calories that they are eating surplus goes into muscle building. So they're either going to be in a very small surplus, or they might be using performance enhancing drugs. They could be a newbie to the gym and maximizing their muscle building capabilities, and whatever surplus they are eating has gone into building muscle. The fourth circumstance that can occur is that you could gain fat and lose muscle within a surplus. This is most likely to occur if there's been somebody who has previously resistance trained and gained a significant amount of muscle, and then they stop for whatever reason. It could be an athlete who gets injured, they've twisted their ankle, they're in the hospital, they have to not have any weight on it, and they have to stay sat down for a month. Over that period, if they're eating within a surplus, their muscle is likely to drop and their fat will grow. How this will occur is if they're eating in a 200 calorie surplus, the 200 calories will go towards fat storage because they're surplus to requirement, and the energy that's being lost in muscle tissue will go into fat storage. So let's say it's 50 calories per day worth of muscle degradation, losing a pound of muscle every 16 days. That extra calories will go into the accrual of fat. This is the scenario that is one of the reasons behind when I earlier said the rules for calories in, calories out. A calorie surplus leads to the gain in the overall energy value of your body's tissues. It doesn't necessarily mean the gain of weight. This is the scenario that is the reason behind that. How this happens is fat is much more energy dense than muscle. So if you were eating in a 200 calorie surplus, this person who's been injured and stopped exercising, after 17 and a half days, they would have gained 1 pound of fat, because that's 200 calories for 17 and a half days, 3,500 calories. That's 1 pound of fat they'd have gained. From the muscle, if they'd lost a huge amount of muscle, let's say that they're really being catabolic and they've lost 4.375 pounds of muscle, that is 3,500 calories worth. So that also goes into the gaining of fat. So in total, that person's gained 2 pounds of fat, 1 pound from the surplus that they've been in over the 17 and a half days, and 1 pound from the muscle they've lost. But as we've just said, muscle wise, because muscle only has 800 calories per pound, that muscle has dropped by 4.375 pounds. So you've gained 2 pounds of fat, but you've lost 4.375 pounds of muscle. Overall, you've lost 2.375 pounds of mass, excluding water weight. Water weight's another factor that changes things. If you were really deprived of water and you'd suddenly been glugging loads of water down, you might gain weight. But if you, what's more likely to have occurred, assuming that you've not drastically changed your water intake, is that your water weight would also have dropped, because muscle in particular holds water. So overall, the body's energy value of its tissues has increased. You've gained 2 pounds of fat, which is 7,000 calories worth, and you used to have 4.375 pounds of muscle, which is only 3,500 calories worth. You've gained an extra 3,500 calories that was coming from the surplus of 200 calories over the 17 and a half days, but overall you've lost weight. This is a strange circumstance. It's not common, but it's important to highlight that this hasn't broken the laws of thermodynamics and it hasn't broken the calories in, calories out equation. It is a situation that is explainable. It's rare, but it can happen. The fifth and final circumstance that can occur within a caloric surplus is that you could lose fat and gain muscle. This is exceptionally unlikely. As we spoke about, muscle building is determined by your genetics, the rate at which you could build muscle, and it's not fast at all. We covered that a 50 calorie surplus would equate to 23 pounds of muscle being built after a year. In order for you to lose fat and gain muscle within a surplus, you would have to be in a pretty small surplus, and then your muscle building would basically have to require more calories than your surplus, and those calories would have to come out of your fat storage. So if you were doing the required things to build 23 pounds of muscle in a year, that would require 50 calories of energy going into muscle building per day. If you were eating in a small surplus, a 25 calorie surplus, your body would use 25 calories going into building muscle, but it requires 50, so another 25 per day would have to come out of fat loss. And of course, fat is much more energy dense than muscle. So over a period of time, if you gain those 23 pounds of muscle, you'd have lost about 3 pounds of fat in the year, gained your 23 pounds of muscle. It is possible within a surplus. That surplus is so tiny, it would be very hard to track, the 25 calorie surplus. It's important to note that it is possible, therefore, to lose fat and gain muscle in a surplus. This is where people often think that that would deny calories in, calories out, because the mantra of calories in, calories out is usually if you're eating too many calories and you're in a surplus, you'll gain weight and fat. And if you're eating too little calories, you'll lose weight and fat. But this is a circumstance where you've been eating surplus to requirement, you've been eating in a surplus, and you've been losing fat. It's exceptionally unlikely. It would require the amount of calories needed to build muscle to be higher than the amount that you are surplus, and extra energy would therefore have to be supplemented from your fat stores. Exceptionally rare, but again, for the point of academic purposes, technically possible. And if you ever do see someone online, some miracle person who maybe has incredible genetics, is maybe a newbie to the gym, and then immediately decides to hop on performance enhancing drugs, terrible idea, by the way, but they might, if they then also optimize what they can do to build muscle, they were sleeping perfectly, they made sure that they weren't stressed in their life, they were eating enough meals and a proper amount of protein, and they were also resistance training on top of eating in that small surplus. They would maybe, that's the only circumstance I could think of where maybe somebody's been so conducive to building muscle that the surplus that they're eating at isn't enough and they have to take extra energy from their fat stores. Very unlikely. Now, for the different body compositional changes that can occur when you're in a deficit. The first, most likely one for most people, particularly if they're not resistance training, is you will lose fat and muscle. You're in a deficit, that energy needs to come out of somewhere. Your body does preferentially take it out of fat reserves. That's the point of fat reserves, they're energy reserves for when you're in a deficit and you need it. But if you were also not resistance training or doing the adequate things to maintain or even grow muscle, the most likely thing is that you will lose muscle as well. So for example, you could be in a 200 calorie deficit. Most of that would come from fat loss. So 180 calories of fat loss could occur, but you might also get 20 calories of muscle degradation. The second scenario that's most likely to occur, and this is likely if somebody's really trying and training to keep their muscle, is that you lose just fat. Your deficit, literally all the calories from your deficit come out of your fat reserves, and they're being used to move about and keep you alive. The third scenario that can occur within a deficit is that you could lose fat and gain muscle. There has been a myth, another myth that needs to get debunked, that you can't build muscle in a deficit. It is possible. Again, by the laws of calories in, calories out, what's essentially happening is you're in a deficit. The calories that you're in a deficit by, let's say you're in a 200 calorie deficit per day, they're getting burnt from your fat reserve, and you do something that's anabolic, muscle growth promoting, and the calories that are required to build that muscle also comes out of the fat reserve. So it could be like an extra 20 calories per day goes into muscle building. So you're just losing fat, but you're also gaining a bit of muscle. This is most likely going to occur from somebody returning from injury, or if they've trained previously, haven't trained for a while and already lost muscle, and they're coming back. Or it could be somebody who's particularly obese. They have lots of fat reserves. They have a lot of energy that they can pull from their fat reserves. They can also gain muscle at the same time in a deficit. It's unlikely for somebody, if you've been training, that you can just decide, oh, I want to build muscle while being in a deficit. Again, people on performance enhancing drugs could achieve this. Don't do them, but for the sake of information, you should know that that does make it more possible. The fourth scenario that is exceptionally unlikely as a deficit is that you could lose pure muscle. You would have to be you would have to have built a tremendous amount of muscle, maybe abused performance enhancing drugs, and then suddenly stopped, being in a deficit, and all the calories that you're in a deficit would come out of muscle building because you're in such a catabolic state. Catabolic's the opposite of anabolic. It means muscle losing, whereas anabolic means muscle gaining. You'd have to be in such a catabolic state as your body's, you've done all these things to promote muscle growth in the past and you've suddenly stopped them. Your body would be dropping muscle at the rate that you're in a deficit. Again, you'd probably have to be in a very small deficit and be in a very catabolic state to be losing muscle at the rate that you're in a deficit. It's unlikely, but it is possible. It wouldn't be able to be sustained for an extended period of time. It's important to note that it can occur, again, for the sake of the fact that it doesn't break calories in, calories out, but nobody could sustain this state of just losing muscle for an extended period. So for 6 months, for a year, there's no way that if somebody maintains even like a 50 calorie deficit, that it could all come from muscle over the course of an extended period of time. The final scenario, which is even more unlikely, but technically possible, is that you could lose muscle and gain fat whilst in a deficit. This is the most unlikely of all the scenarios. I haven't seen a single example of this, but due to the laws of thermodynamics, it is technically possible. What would need to happen is the amount of calories you're in a deficit, all of that energy would have to come out of your muscle, and then extra energy would have to come out of your muscle in order to accrue fat. Almost impossible. I can't think of a single example that this has happened, but if you ever do encounter an example of this, it hasn't broken the laws of thermodynamics. It hasn't broken the calories in, calories out equation. This person must just be doing the most catabolic thing that they could possibly do. And somehow, maybe if they're eating exceptionally poor macros, they're eating no protein whatsoever, so that their muscles being lost, and they're eating lots of like fat sources like oils to promote the gain of fat. But in a deficit, it's exceptionally hard to gain that fat tissue. It wouldn't really occur. It's basically impossible, but theoretically it is possible. And finally, the scenarios that can occur while at maintenance, the different body compositional changes that can occur. Obviously, you're at maintenance, so it's not really changing. The first one we'll cover, the easy one, is that there's no change whatsoever. You're eating at maintenance calories. You're not in a surplus or deficit. You're continuing to exist the way you have been, and you just maintain whatever physique and body composition you existingly have. The second scenario that could occur is to gain fat and lose muscle. This is basically the same as within a surplus, except you don't have the surplus calories extra going into it. So if you were to gain fat and lose muscle while at maintenance, what you'd have to do, it would probably be somebody who's stopped training or done some catabolic activity in order to drop their muscle level. The energy that's going from losing that muscle is going into storage of fat. Again, at this stage, I'd highlight that if you lost 4.375 pounds of muscle, you'd only gain 1 pound of fat. So you'd be eating at maintenance. The energy within your body has maintained, but it's been transferred from muscle tissue into fat tissue, and your body would have lost 3.375 pounds just from that energy going from muscle tissue into fat tissue. So it's possible to lose weight in a deficit. And finally, the last scenario that can occur at maintenance is the opposite of that. You could gain muscle and lose fat. This is quite possible if somebody is training properly and they're eating at maintenance calories. They're doing enough to build muscle. Energy is required to build that muscle. That energy isn't coming from an external source. You're not eating in a surplus. So that energy has to come from somewhere, and it comes from your fat reserves. And finally, the last thing to say about body composition, and probably the most complicated part, is body fat percentages. We've covered what can happen with certain body compositional changes in a surplus, maintenance, deficit, and how likely they are. Some of those circumstances are strange, but with body fat percentages, even given certain changes in body compositional masses, so decreases in fat and increases in muscle, or vice versa, and different proportions, the opposite to what you think can occur with body fat percentage. So there are 3 of these counterintuitive examples with body fat percentage. The first one, which is possible, is that you could lose body fat percentage without changing your body fat mass at all. How this would occur is in the scenario where you're eating in a surplus and all of those calories go into muscle building, you're accumulating muscle, but you're not accumulating fat. So whilst you have the same amount of fat tissue, it becomes a smaller percentage and you lose body fat percentage whilst accruing lean muscle mass. As an example, somebody, I'm going to use round numbers, these are unlikely body compositional changes to occur, but if there is a 200-pound person who is 20% body fat, they have 160 pounds of lean mass total. So their muscle, their bones, their toenails, their teeth, ligaments, tendons, whatever. Their lean mass is 160 pounds. Their fat mass is 40 pounds. They are at 20% body fat at 200 pounds. After a certain amount of time, if they eat in a surplus and all of those calories go into muscle building, let's say after a long time they gain 50 pounds of clean muscle. They're now at 250 pounds and they still only have 40 pounds of fat mass. So what happens now is their body fat was at 20%, they haven't lost any fat mass, but their fat percentage is now at 16% body fat. 40 pounds of mass is 16% body fat for a 250-pound human. Now, it's a very unlikely scenario to occur, but it illustrates the point that you can lose body fat percentage while maintaining your fat mass. So, to go further than that, the second counterintuitive example is that somebody could gain fat mass but lose overall body fat percentage. To take the 200-pound person we had before as an example, this is the easiest way to illustrate it. If there was this 200-pound person who's 20% body fat, they have 40 pounds of fat and 160 pounds of lean tissue. If they gained, over a period of time, they were eating in a surplus, it's a small surplus, most of their calories are going to muscle building, but a few are going to gaining fat as well. Let's say after a period of time, they have gained 45 pounds of muscle and 5 pounds of fat. What has now happened is they've gone from 160 pounds lean to 205 pounds of lean mass. They've gone from 40 pounds of fat to 45 pounds of fat, and they've gone from 200 pounds overall to 250 pounds overall. Their 45 pounds of fat that they now have, as a percentage of the 250 pounds that they now weigh, makes them 18% body fat. They started at 20% body fat. They gained 5 pounds of fat mass, but they've lost 2% body fat. Basically, in order to lose body fat percentage, what you have to do is gain, if you're in a surplus and you're gaining tissue, is gain more muscle in proportion to your fat than you previously had. So the amount gained in this example was 50 pounds, and 5 of that was fat mass. So only 10% body fat, 10% of the new amount of muscle and fat that was added was body fat. And existingly, they were 20% body fat. So that brought the level down to 18% body fat. The final and least likely counterintuitive example that can occur with body fat percentage is that you can actually gain body fat percentage while losing body fat. What that would require is for you to lose proportionally more muscle than you've lost fat. So if we were to take basically the inverse of the example we just gave, if there was a 250 pound person who was 18% body fat, they had 205 pounds of lean mass, 45 pounds of fat mass. If they were in a deficit, a really harsh deficit, and they lost loads of muscle, they'd previously maybe tried to optimize the amount of muscle mass they had, and they suddenly stopped everything. Maybe they came off anabolic steroids, maybe they were injured and started just lying completely still and eating like crap and wasn't sleeping enough during the night. They dropped loads of muscle mass and a bit of fat. If they dropped 45 pounds of muscle and 5 pounds of fat, it's very unlikely, but they would then become that 200-pound person who has 160 lean pounds, 40 pounds of fat mass. They're at 20% body fat, even though, of course, they dropped 5 pounds of fat mass. So it is possible to lose fat mass but gain body fat percentage. That scenario in particular is really, really unlikely. The most likely one that is to occur was the first example, which is if somebody does gain just muscle tissue, their body fat percentage will drop, even though they've not been in a deficit, they've not been losing any fat mass.